Imagine a body of water so clear you could look through it and see the bottom. It was said that the early Dutch settlers found oyster reefs so plentiful here that the oysters lined the harbor for miles and miles and were considered a navigational hazard. But all that changed in the early 19th century.
The Gowanus Canal was covered with industries, tanning industries, dye factories, and everything got dumped into the canal.
Try to take the sample.
Retired after 30 years with the New York Power Authority and armed with a graduate degree in marine biology, Bart Chesser decided he wanted to make a difference for the waters of the Bay Ridge Flats.
The point at which I started this project, there was some small work going on in oysters. Nothing was going on in terms of actually trying to put oysters on the bottom and seeing how they grow. So to do that, you need permits from the New York City Department of Environmental Conservation, the Corps of Engineers.
It was a lot of writing and researching what's the perfect spot, what's the perfect substrate, how do we get from A to B by starting with a small research project.
Katie met Bart 5 years ago with the New York, New Jersey Baykeepers Oyster Restoration Program. Bart was sure that building an oyster reef would help clean the water. After getting approvals from the city 3 years ago, he chartered a boat with volunteers and scuba divers from the New York Harbor School and set out to build a natural oyster reef.
What's that, Eli?
So we shouldn't be hooking and booting the laptop until this is outside of the board?
The research boat visits the site every 3 months. Today, scientists are prepared to deploy an automated water quality monitor into the oyster bed.
It monitors water quality parameters, things like temperature, the salinity of the water, how much particulate matter is flowing through the water, what are some of the biological characteristics of that particulate matter. And so we'll be able to understand sort of the environment from the oyster's point of view.
Incoming.
The last visit here was early May, when 5,000 pounds of oyster shells were dropped from the boat to create the bed for the baby spat.
The middle of last year, we started putting oysters on a grid, and really it's just a mesh with a 1-inch opening, a wire, and we basically drill a hole in an oyster, and with plastic ties we connect the shell to the grid.
The installation itself is 25 by 25 feet. On top of the oyster shells that cover that area, we have 25 grids, which are about 2 by 2 foot each. The grid is wire mesh with PVC tubing around it, and attached to each grid is about 25 oyster shells. Today we're hopeful that we'll go out and we'll see not only that those baby oysters that we put out there, the hatchery-raised oysters, are doing well, but I'm also hopeful that we might see wild settlement, wild oysters, landing on some of those grids or on some of the shells that we place down on the reef.
There is a short 2-hour window to do all the work needed before the tides and rough currents turn the area deadly.
Lower high tide and then slack tide after that, because when the tide gets going, in the harbor out there, it can rip 4 or 5 knots.
Near corner is 3.
Is that the northwest corner?
I don't know.
Okay.
The grids start to come up and the news is not good. There are huge die-offs in corners of the site.
We're going to select 5 shells at random, and then on the inside of the shell we're going to see if there are any oyster babies.
Okay.
And if there are, count those.
It looks like they've been in thick black mud, but they're not now. So there's some scouring action that's removing some of the sediment that's been down there. But we still have a little bit more that we'd like to look at, so I'm not sure.
This is an oyster drill, and these are the ones that actually do kill oysters.
The baby oysters are having a hard time competing with the many predators that feed on them.
Just a lot of mortality.
All right, over the
Probably
hat.
like 85% right now.
Lots of crabs, green crabs, blue crabs, tons of starfish. They're great looking, but they eat our oysters, which is kind of a bummer.
The one grid that's been down there the longest, those oysters are now fully grown, market-sized oysters, really good-looking oysters.
So we're only counting the live oysters, even if they're dead. We're not counting them.
The researchers are hoping that this reef will build habitat for other animals and provide nutrients and filtration to clean the waters.
The big one you hear is that a healthy oyster, maybe in the Chesapeake, could filter 50 gallons of water a day. Up here, where we don't have necessarily big reefs full of full-sized oysters, I think it's probably less than that.
The big question is, will these oysters be safe to eventually eat?
When you're commercially growing oysters, and if you're in partly polluted areas, sometimes they do remove the shellfish, clams, and oysters to another area, and that's clean water, and they go through a depuration process which would clean it. But that's not our intention. Our intention is to try to restore oyster reefs here. Whether 10, 20 years from now there's a potential for commercial oysters, that's a question we'll worry about later. Right now, it's oyster restoration and the environmental benefits that could accrue from doing that.
Did you take a look at